David Primo with us from the University of Rochester. David, I want to bring your quote up right away because I think this will get everybody's blood going. A lot of people agree with you. A lot of people say no. The dangers of our debt and deficit levels are no longer the province of commissions whose reports gather dust. We've elected officials taking a stand, I'll say in spades, in proposing changes to the status quo. But with that, Professor, aren't they miles apart as they take their stands?
They are miles apart because I think they're looking ahead to the 2012 elections instead of thinking about what we need to do to actually fix what's wrong with the fiscal situation in this country. The goal should be to put in place constitutional rules that both sides can sign on to. And right now, there really isn't a plan in place that has that feature, and I think that is a problem.
When you look at this and the idea of a plan, many people, particularly conservatives, will say what we need is a constitutional amendment, which we've heard going back to the Civil War and, frankly, even before that. Do we need a constitutional amendment to solve our collective irresponsibility?
I think we do. And the reason is that members of Congress can always undo any deals that they reach. So despite all of the sequesters and other provisions put into these pieces of legislation that would supposedly come into effect if agreements aren't abided by, the bottom line is, in 5 years, if members of Congress want to increase spending, they can do so. The only thing that's going to keep them in check is the Constitution.
I mean, it's just remarkable. You say a Constitution. Michael McKee was just pushing back a little bit of that, thinking of President Reagan of years ago. Doesn't that limit our flexibility, our economic flexibility? Not so much monetary policy, maybe there on a second-order basis, but doesn't it limit Treasury or House Ways and Means Committee under crisis if they have to push against an amendment?
It doesn't if it's designed correctly. So one of the principles of effective constitutional budget rule design is that you have what I call escape clauses, or ways that you can get around the rules in true emergency situations. So in the case of a depression or severe economic downturn, you have provisions in that amendment that would allow the government to spend more. But the bottom line is that year in and year out, members of Congress and the president, frankly, spend more than the American people ought to be paying. And the only way to fix that is through a constitutional amendment. And I agree, though, that design is crucial.
Yeah, design is crucial. Design this. Here's a chart, David, of our spacious debt, U.S. gross government debt to GDP. Victor, go in on the number in the upper left corner. That's a number 75. You can't, it's over there in the upper left corner. There you go, 75. Think 90. Think 92. The IMF put out a memo I saw on their wonderful website modeling a 92% under one of the plans that we're addressing. Now, David Primo, we all agree it's out of control. Do you have any confidence we can nudge it into control in the next 2 to 5 years?
My hope is that what we have is a two-part plan. The first part would be a plan that would actually move us toward stabilization of the debt to GDP ratio. So if we can keep it at 70%, that's way too high in my opinion, but better than it going to 100% as the CBO is predicting. That's the first step, sort of stabilize and get spending under control. The second step is to put in place a constitutional rule that will keep that momentum going when you have new members of Congress, when you have a new president. And I think that's the crucial piece of the puzzle, is that you need something in place to make these agreements credible. And that's one of the pieces of the S&P's report that's not gotten enough attention. What does credible exactly mean? I would argue it means a constitutional budget rule.
I mean, I look at one of your papers here, and you know, Teacher of the Year at the University of Rochester, a model discipline, political science, and the logic of representations. Is there any logic to what's going on in Washington?
Well, you know, it's funny. We, in political science, often model elected officials with algebraic equations. But what's going on in Washington right now is logical to some degree if your goal is re-election and your goal is to score political points. But if your goal is actually to fix the budget problem, what's going on right now in Washington is really making a mockery of the legislative process.
Well, let's look at one of the thoughts. A quiet day on the op-ed landscape. I think everybody getting up ready to write for the weekend. Krugman always writing New York Times, a cult. that is destroying America. We have influential pundits like David Primo calling out for a new centrist party, a new centrist president to get us away from the evils of partisanship. David, it's a point here. We all want to find a middle ground, but we are not a nation of middle ground, are we?
No, and we need to be able to agree to disagree in some sense. So you see a lot of stories now about how partisanship is terrible, how it used to be better yesterday. I'm not so sure that's the case. The problem we're facing today, though, is a problem we faced before, and that is that elected officials have incentives to spend now, worry about problems tomorrow. And what you need is a leader to come in, step above the fray and say, I'm going to take some political risks here. I'm going to take some electoral risks. You have to wonder about elected officials who care more about getting into office again than about actually solving our nation's problems. And I think when we can find those leaders, we'll actually get some movement, even though we have great political differences.
Professor Primo, thank you so much. This is very controversial, folks, this idea of a constitutional amendment.